Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 26 of my secular Bible study series in which we are looking at Ezekiel. And I know I say this every time, but what a book. Seriously, this is one of the strangest, craziest books in the Bible, definitely of the major prophets. There is so much that happens. There are so many different interpretations, even amongst believers. I feel overwhelmed at covering it in a high-level overview like this. But that is a secular Bible study series. So we're going to do our best in the next 30 minutes roughly to go through this book and present all 7 points to you. So before we jump into point 1, book overview, let me just give you some background here. Ezekiel is a contemporary to Jeremiah. So we have a time frame here that is different than some of the other major prophets. And something that I haven't explained very well is that there were a couple waves, if you will, of Babylon attacking Jerusalem. And in the first wave, they have not yet destroyed the temple. They have taken captives. They are bringing them into exile as refugees, and that is where we have Ezekiel. He has been captured in this first wave. Not to be confused with the many times I've described the multiple waves going back to Jerusalem after the Persians conquer Babylon and start letting some of the Israelites go back home. If we're calling Jeremiah the weeping prophet, we're calling Ezekiel God's watchman. He is in exile with the people who still believe that Jerusalem and the temple specifically can never be destroyed, can never be captured. And he is there to warn them that yes, it can if you don't turn from your ways still. Ezekiel is also unique in that he is both trained as a priest, but also a prophet. And we see a lot of that priestly influence come into this book. Like Isaiah and Jeremiah, this book has plenty of prophecy about immediate events that were happening in his time that relate to his people that Christians will, of course, look back on and try to map Jesus onto, but we'll talk about that more towards point 7. So let's just get into it. Point 1. Book overview. What's the summary here? What's happening? Well, we have 48 chapters and things start cooking right away. Ezekiel chapter 1 is when Ezekiel gets his first vision. To set the time and place, he has already been taken into captivity. He is about 5 years in at this point, I believe. It's his 30th birthday, and he's sitting down having some nice quiet time, reflecting on the fact that if he had not been captured, he would be back in Jerusalem, and 30 is when you can enter the priesthood. And what a convenient time for God to show up and give him a vision. And that's exactly what happens. And this is where we get the whole God's chariot, this movable throne on wheels. And the descriptions are crazy. The wheels have eyes. There's all kinds of symbolism going on here that we can talk about at another time. I did go into more detail about the importance of God being able to move out of his throne of cherubim where his feet are resting upon the Ark of the Covenant. I covered that in Dissecting the Divine. I think it was episode 3. So check that out. But this vision is a big deal. And the way that people have interpreted this vision is also very important and very varied. So I've seen interpretations where Christians will point to, yeah, look, God follows them to Babylon. He goes where his people go. Because previously, God's residence was in the temple. And there's a safe bet to be made that there would have been a statue of Yahweh in the temple representing him instead of this obvious living God that is there. Again, this is secular Bible study series. So if God's statue is back in the temple and the people have been taken into Babylon, even though the temple hasn't yet been destroyed, they are now a people without a God. Says Ezekiel, this God is now on the move and he can come with us. But others see this moving chariot of God as God leading his people away from Jerusalem, taking them to exile. It was God that did it, not Babylon. As we've talked about in the previous books, Babylon was just the sword with which God chose to bring his divine judgment and justice. So God being on the move is saying, hey, I can leave my temple. I'm above all of this. And now it's time to bring my wrath upon you. And so he is actually leading this chariot, taking his people into captivity. So again, both versions could kind of hold a place together at the same time, or of course, those different interpretations mean very different things for certain believers. And so that's a big part of this. And again, we need to start picking up steam because that's literally just like chapter 1. Up until chapters 4, we have God's warning. This is when he is telling Ezekiel all the things that are going to happen, the judgment that's going to come down, the temple being destroyed. And again, it's important to remember that the people in exile would have just thought like, okay, yeah, we got captured. This isn't good. God's given us a timeout, but surely we will never lose him. Surely we will never lose our inherited land, our temple, our place of worship, etc. And Ezekiel is saying, wake up, or at least God is telling Ezekiel to tell these people to wake up, which is going to lead us into chapters 4, 5, maybe 6 a little bit, where Ezekiel puts on a performance. Now, picture yourself there. You're in exile. You believe in this God. You believe in prophets, that he speaks through people. You've had so many different judges, kings, and prophets that you've been hearing about in the oral traditions that maybe you even encountered on your own. And it seems like they've been ramping up with Isaiah and Jeremiah in terms of this performative aspect of prophecy, and Ezekiel takes it to the next level. And in 4 and 5, we have him doing these big symbolic gestures like street performance. And the first one is setting up kind of this mini scale of Jerusalem with a brick and showing that it can be crushed. Again, really trying to get it into the people's heads like this is going to happen. There's like 3 or 4 others, but the one that stands out the most is when Ezekiel is told to lay on his side for 390 days, I think, and then turn over and lay on the other side for 40 days. And that's supposed to represent the each day for a year of punishment that will come to both Jerusalem and Judah being the 40-day one. Now, this is a lot of controversy here. Did he actually stay on his side for over a year, like truly corded, stuck on his side? Or did he just symbolically do this maybe for like 10 minutes in the street for his performance of the day for over a year? It gets weirder as well because he is told to eat bread cooked over human feces. He bargains and argues with God that that's taking things too far, and God allows him to do cow dung instead, which is still just a ridiculous concept. But again, this is all very symbolic, and we're supposed to believe that even though it's symbolic, he actually did these things. It's just to what extent. And the fact that he would argue with God about not wanting to use human feces says that these things, at least according to the story, did indeed take place. And so you have all this performative, like, watch out, this is real, God's going to do this, let me make this as visceral and real for you as possible. And each one has a particular theme. Again, I'd love to spend like half an hour going through that. We're going to keep moving forward. The next few chapters are God telling Ezekiel, like, don't worry about it, man, because guess what? They're not going to believe you anyways. They're not going to listen. All their hearts are hard. And I want you to remember that for what's going to come up here in a little while. God is essentially saying, like, this is pointless. Then why give the visions to Ezekiel? Why call him to do this? You can tell very early on that this is all after the fact, and we are just trying to give reasons. These people are trying to attach meaning and importance and understanding to this horrific situation that they find themselves in. That leads us to chapters like 8 through 11, which is where we get the first temple vision. There's another temple vision that is separate of a temple yet to come. This one is a vision of the temple actually being destroyed. And again, this would have been like revolutionary to these people at this time. And in his vision, Ezekiel sees all of these people worshiping other gods, both inside and outside the temple, and these debaucherous acts and this idol worship, etc. God's biggest no-no. And thus, the temple will be destroyed. And that is the vision we get in chapters 8 through 11. At the end of 11, though, we get this weird part of the prophecy from God, which is that despite all of this that will happen and the horror that will be the temple being destroyed and the people being fully removed from Jerusalem, God will eventually fix this in part with a small group of people being able to return, and that everything will be made better because God will give them new hearts, softer hearts. Hearts with compassion and love. Stick around as we cover some of these verses in point 7, because this is hugely problematic for free will, as is like everything we've covered in the last 25 episodes. Chapters 12 through 32, I'm going to just gloss over a bunch right now. Okay, this is very high level, but this is the judgment of Israel, so to speak. We get all of these different comparisons. I think there's like, again, 4 or 5 of just how awful these people are, whether it is an unfaithful wife or promiscuous sisters or a lion that cannot be tamed, etc. There's many different examples that are given. And again, we definitely get a lot of that unfaithful wife versus God as the husband, weird sexual component, the jealousy that kicks in there, which puts into perspective, I think, and we've talked about this in some of the previous books, so I won't belabor the point, but really puts into perspective God's judgment and justice as really just kind of an abusive spouse that's fed up with the activity or behavior of their partner. Also during this, we get plenty of verses on these people are past the point of no return. No prayer is going to fix this at this point. I think it's during these sections where Ezekiel's saying even the most righteous, the Noahs, the Jobs, I think maybe the other person mentioned is Daniel, even their prayers wouldn't work. God is just done. He can be bargained with to change human feces to cow feces, but not to save the people that he chose above all other people to be rescued. So much for all those New Testament pretty verses about God who always listens and answers prayers. Similar to some of the other prophet books, the next few 7 or 8 chapters, like 25 through 32, have to do with the judgment on the nations around them. And we've been through this quite a bit, so I'm not going to list them all, but you have God talking about how Babylon is going to do his bidding essentially and take out all these other nations. Now, there's also a bunch of really baked in promises here that simply do not come true. Like, hey, God is ridding the world of evil. Like he's conquering evil once and for all. He's going to lay waste and siege to these places, and then everything will be sunshine and rainbows. He'll give a new heart to his people, and everything will be better. And that just simply didn't happen, did it? Right? Like, it's just so funny that the clear things that are prophesied in this book that we know didn't happen are ignored, and the very murky ones where some of this is supposed to be pointing to Jesus's death on the cross are completely fabricated and painfully tried to be woven into this story. It's just time to call a spade a spade. And then we get this kind of climax of the book, which is chapter 33, in which a refugee comes and tells Ezekiel, I was there, it finally happened, the city has fallen, the temple has fallen. This is a huge blow. Everything Ezekiel has been warning about has now happened, and it's getting pretty real. But like many biblical books, we had all the warnings, all the judgment, this apex, and then some hope. That's why Lamentations was so weird. No hope, just utterly lamenting the true destruction and wrath of God. But not with Ezekiel. We get hope for all those sets. We get hope for Israel, hope for the nations, the rest of the world, etc. And so these chapters cover the hope for Israel, a new David, which is where many people are pointing towards Jesus, a new Israel, which there are so many interpretations of what that means. And this time we get the vision of the valley of the dry bones. And so Ezekiel sees this wasteland, all these dead skeletons, the dry bones. When I was a kid, I couldn't help but always picture the elephant graveyard from Lion King, just to give you a visual. And obviously this is the waste that has been laid to Jerusalem and to its people. But what happens in this vision is the wind, or God's breath. There's some kind of allusions back to Genesis. In fact, we have a lot of kind of Garden of Eden imagery throughout the rest of this book. This wind, or God's breath, or spirit that moves through these bones starts to bring them back to life piece by piece, little by little. And this is God's restoration. This is going on to, again, the new hearts for his people, a new creation, which is why people like to kind of associate this with some of the born again concepts of the New Testament, creating people from the dust of the earth. Again, Valley of Dry Bones is very Eden-esque in God's original creation. And so this is kind of a new start again. It's like a mini, weird, messed up Noah's Ark story, right? God gets fed up with everyone. He saves one family to start over again, starting over with the animals again, a lot of imagery painting back to the garden. In this version, you have God getting on his wheeled chariot throne and sending his people to destruction and exile, the flood, and then breathing new life into them again, just like the winds took the waters down in the flood, and starting over. New hearts, new bodies, etc. I think that's a really interesting part of the book, and one I'd love to talk about further, but we're going to move on. Now we're going to go into the next few chapters, Hope for the Nations. We get this Gog figure, and it's really an amalgamation of evil, of all the enemies of God, of all the bad nations that weren't the chosen people, pretty much Gentiles. And this is where God says he will eradicate this once and for all and get rid of evil amongst the nations. And again, it doesn't happen. Like, yes, some of these surrounding places do indeed also get taken out by Babylon, but not all of them, and not to the degree in which God says. And it definitely didn't bring about just everyone worshiping the same God afterwards or anything like that. Then we get into chapters 40 through 46, and this is where we get the new temple vision. Get ready for a ton more debate and interpretation if you try to go understand what this actually is. And every believer will tell you why they're so confident their version is correct. But Ezekiel gets a vision of a new temple. And I think there's good reason to believe that this would have been referencing just the rebuilding of the temple when they come back from exile, except that that actually happened, and we know that the splendor and the glory was way less than Solomon's original temple. And so it can't be that. So we have to believe that this is a literal temple still yet to be built. Maybe Israel will do it tomorrow, who knows? Or maybe this is just totally symbolic and it's the kingdom of God. It's what happens after Jesus comes and we get a new covenant and the Gentiles are grafted in and everyone is always in the presence of God and the Spirit of God. Now that we have access to the Holy Spirit, that's one interpretation. There's apocalyptic interpretations, there's heaven interpretations, but the idea is that the entire city is a temple and it reaches out for everyone everywhere, and it's safe and it's the healing food and all of these things that you could point to any of these different interpretations. And by the way, I just feel that it's worth pointing out the purpose of prophecy, according to the Bible, is supposed to be specific. It's supposed to be helpful. It's supposed to be actionable. And so if 2,000 years later, we still can't agree, did it happen? Has it happened yet? When it happens, will it be this or this? Like, does anyone else not see a problem here? But I digress. And the book ends with chapters 47 through 48, which is we see the stream coming from the temple, and it goes out to water everything that it touches. So even outside of the chosen people, the holy city, and it makes its way to the end of the world, back then, the Dead Sea, and flourishes the Dead Sea to a living sea. We get new creation, new life, again, a ton of Eden imagery. There is a lot going on here. Again, a lot of different literal versus symbolic representations of all of this, which is par for the course for any prophetic book, but especially with Ezekiel. It's like, what does this guy mean? That's book overview. Thanks for bearing with me. I think it's fascinating. I hope that you found it interesting. Stick with me. Let's dive right into point 2, which is authorship and date. Here's another fun fact about Ezekiel. We finally have a book named after an individual that was more than likely written by this individual and even agreed upon by the scholars. He talks in the first person. It's extremely consistent with the writing type and the literary styles, etc. Like, this has a real chance of being written by a real person with this name thinking these thoughts, not that these things actually happened. We can skip the dating part of this. We can even skip point 3, which is historical accuracy, background, and context. We have covered this series of events with the captivity and the exile, etc., in like 5 other books. So you can go watch any of those books and pretty much get the exact same thing. Let's move straight into point 4, which is going to be literary analysis. Again, this book is unique. It uses some of the main themes we've seen. We have prophecy, we have poetry, we have prose, we have symbolic visions. The prose sections are good. They're pretty linear, although there's a lot of things where you kind of feel like you enter a dream state. You know, at one point when you have God defeating Gog and all of these 7 nations, he's doing it over and over and over. It's not like, oh, he did it here and then here. It's like, oh, he did it with an earthquake. Oh, he burned them. Oh, he burned them again. Oh, he laid waste on a battlefield. Like, just these events that must be more symbolic because we're trying to see all the power of God, all the destructive nature, all the divine judgment. And instead of like making it work in one cohesive linear story, he's like, I'll just tell the same story 4 times and change the details. There's things like that that make the prose a little hard to follow. And we do have some timeline jumping, which is not necessarily a huge issue, but it's not as straightforward as some of the other narrative texts that we've had so far in this canon. As for the poetry aspect, what's weird about this is if you've followed me with the other 25 books, we have poetry often used, but it's used in a very particular way, in a very particular spot of the book. It's kind of grouped together. Here we have just elements of poetry kind of interspersed throughout the book. And I think it adds to the emotional impact. Ezekiel is supposed to be very emotional. It's not just the stern warning. It's not just the sadness of Jeremiah. This is, guys, this is our last chance. Look, we're here. We've been taken and it can get worse. We can lose our temple. We can lose our city altogether. We may never come back from this. This is what God's telling me. And so the interspersed poetry here is just adding to that emotive response. And I think it's really interesting to see how it's utilized in this book in comparison to some of the others. And then the visions. So many visions also interspersed, but for particular reasons. We're seeing things come to life. Okay, we need God to come to Babylon. Vision 1, moving chariot. Okay, we need to see what's going on at the temple currently and why God is even doing this and threatening that the temple can and will be destroyed. Okay, we need visions of what the new temple will be like so that there's hope amongst all of this chaos and loss. And so the visions, and there's more than the ones I've just mentioned or even that I've covered so far in the overview, they happen in these intervals, but they're very purposeful, I think is maybe the right word for them. What else to say about literary analysis? Again, bringing the words to life, these oracles, these dramas, these skits, if you will, that Ezekiel is doing, this huge emphasis on imagination and visualization. It's all about engaging the audience. Ezekiel is dealing with a broken people, a doubting people, a confused people, a hurt people, but also people that ideally, according to the text, still really believe in the permanence of their blessing, in the permanence of their birthrights, to own a certain land, to have the most powerful God, to keep that God in their presence, in the temple, etc. So that's probably it for literary analysis, which leads us nicely into point 5 with main themes, which you guessed it, number one main theme in this book, like many, divine judgment. Ezekiel is the watchman. Here it comes. Get ready. I can see it. You will too if you don't get your act together. Judgment for us, judgment for our neighbors, judgment for the world. God is pissed. He's done listening. He is not forgiving. It is time for wrath. So a second point might be then God's sovereignty, because what we're learning very clearly that many Christians will forget by the time the New Testament arrives, God can do whatever he wants. He doesn't owe you anything. He doesn't have to be consistent. He doesn't have to do what he said he's going to do. He doesn't have to fulfill anything on his time frame. He doesn't have to keep you safe. He doesn't have to keep you well. He doesn't have to worry about you or your children. God will do what God wants to do and call it good and call it just. That was such a main part of Lamentations as well, is coming to grips with this God. That's why a central theme throughout so much of all of this is the fear of God. It's not some pretty way that we've reinterpreted it in the modern age of this healthy respect for God's power. Nope. It was the literal fear of God, because God is doing terrifying things on purpose to instill fear to get desired behavior, which is worship and worship alone of him. That's it. That's like the whole Old Testament. A third theme, and this one I think is unique and very strange. We've seen a lot of collective punishment, which is horrendous. We're starting to see some individualistic punishment. It's slight, so maybe it's not a main theme, but Ezekiel versus everyone else is the first person to start talking about kind of this individual responsibility. Not that that helps anyone, because they're still not getting judged individually, but I did notice that rereading this and thought I would call it out. We could always, of course, talk about moral accountability and ethical living and all of these other things that are kind of interweaved within, but I think we hit on the main theme. So let's move on to point 6, reception and influence. In terms of the Jewish tradition, it's similar to Lamentations in that it is reminders of God's wrath, of the need for obedience, putting God first, tradition, order, etc. Pretty simple, but leave it to the Christians in terms of their reception of this text to add all the implications. Oh, the valley of the dry bones, says Augustine? No, that's talking about the resurrection of Jesus, right? And that's just one example of the hundreds of things that come from this book that Christians have twisted into matching up with their New Testament ideas. So for a lot of Christians, this is a transition book between the Old and the New Testament. This is helping us understand, and Isaiah is another good book that is pointed to and abused in this way. New David, that's definitely Jesus. New Covenant, that means we're not bound by the law anymore. Like, there's so many things that don't make sense. I understand when you're growing up in it and you just hear these things and you're told these stories and you're indoctrinated and you get the examples, you're like, yeah. Like, what I struggle with is when this was first happening, and well, actually, we know this. We have so many different versions of early Christianity who couldn't find Jesus here. Not to mention the Jews who still haven't found Jesus here. It's just this one particular Jewish cult that was following Jesus that had some pretty fervent believers, which does not say anything to the truth of the claim, just how much they believed it, as Matt Dillahunty likes to say, and I think it's an excellent way of saying it. Add that on with some power and influence with Rome adopting it for their own personal use, and bam, it turns into a worldwide religion with no one stopping and saying, wait, but does it make sense? Again, many people said that, just not loud enough or collectively enough to stop the train. It had left the station, and now we have Christianity. Ezekiel also has a lot of influence over later prophecy. It's just this huge paradigm shift, if you will, into these grander visions. I mean, it even really sets the stage for a lot of revelation. It's just amazing how foundational it is for so much of what would come in this religion. Okay, moving on to point 7. Typically, we would cover contradictions and problematic passages. In terms of contradictions, the hard part about books of prophecy is that there's no agreement on what exactly each prophecy means, what each vision means, what each gesture means. I'll give you an example, like the vision of the temple, some of the dimensions that we get. Well, if we were comparing that to, say, Solomon's temple or the new temple rebuild, we know that those are off. Well, then the Christian says no contradictions, obviously just pointing to the next temple rebuild or heaven or God's presence on earth, etc. And so we could go through a lot of these one by one, but let me just give you some things that would be up for negotiation at the very least, depending on how you interpret each prophecy or action. We could have conversations around the following: the meaning and representation with the divine chariot, the meaning of all of those symbolic actions by Ezekiel and their time frames and their duration, the vision of the valley of dry bones. Depending on how you interpret that, some of those things would be immediately in contradiction with parts of Revelation or what we know to have actually already happened. Like, again, it's just so murky that I don't want to confuse anyone or just make bigger problems or turn molehills into mountains. But I'm sorry, let me just continue a list here for you. The symbolic nature of Ezekiel shaving his head and beard, all kinds of messes there. Even in Ezekiel 1, when Ezekiel, not just the moving chariot, but kind of the description of God here is very different than what we've seen elsewhere, or even his capabilities to be able to move. This is an evolution of God, and it is in contrast to what we see of a very different God in earlier texts. The role of Gog and Magog, oh my gosh, there's so much there, and I know I glossed over it in book overview. I did so for a reason. I think that's something that we'll do an entire video on to break down and really understand. The portrayal of Tyre and Egypt. So a lot of the judgment of other nations was something that lined up with what we've seen in other books, you know, the Ammonites, the Philistines, etc. They all got theirs too, just like Israel got theirs. But some of the things that are said to have happened to the leaders and the people of Tyre and Egypt didn't happen. And some of the things that it says will be of those lands is simply not the case. There's like 20 more I could give you, but we're just going to move on. We're going to talk about problematic passages here and wrap this up. So let's get our text. And by the way, next Thursday then will be Daniel. I'm really excited to cover that with you. And let's see some of the main issues that we find in this book of insanity. How about chapter 9, verse 6? Kill old men outright, young men and maidens, little children and women, but touch no one whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. So they begin with the elders who were before the house. Then he said to them, defile the house, and fill the courts with the slain. Go out. So they went out and struck in the city. No one gets a pass from God. Not the old, not the sick, not the weak, not the young, not the women. This is God's design. I know we've covered that in a lot of books because this keeps coming up with God being so direct. I'll just tell you a quick personal story. I was attending a church when I was really doubting and really struggling. I wasn't calling myself an atheist. I never thought I would get there. I just did not understand this. And our pastor was making some sermon about how we make idols today. And he was comparing it to the Canaanites who worshipped Marduk and who sacrificed their kids to Marduk and how awful it was. And at the end of each sermon, we could text in questions and he would answer them live on the spot, which was actually really cool, except you couldn't engage any further than that. And I asked a question. I said, okay, sacrificing kids, bad, but why does God command the murder of kids then? And he gave an answer that many give, which is a mixture of, I don't know, but if I had to guess, here's a couple outs for you. It could have been hyperbole, which I'm sure he just got from Paul Copen's book, or maybe they were Nephilim, yada, yada, yada. But what I think is just so ridiculous is everyone always focuses on the Canaanite verses and doesn't look when God commands for his own chosen people to have their babies dashed upon the rocks and forced to be eaten by their mothers. That's not hyperbole. God meant it literally. We saw in the last book in Lamentations, God wanted people to walk past and witness the horror so that they would know his wrath was real. We know that they weren't Canaanites. They weren't some Nephilim. They weren't some horrible enemy that had to be completely eradicated. They're God's chosen people. So what is the defense for God killing babies. There isn't one. Not without some sick, twisted, ridiculous collective punishment coping. It's just so insane to me. Let's try 18:20. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So I wanted to point this verse out because I told you there that there were all these hints of individual punishment versus the collective punishment. And I think this is maybe I'm going to do a video of like a timeline so you can really see, but I think this is like the 13th flip-flop from God since Genesis of, yes, I'm going to punish people for the sins of their fathers, or no, I'm not going to do that. Back and forth, back and forth. Here's a contradiction for you. The babies that were just murdered in the last verse are suffering for the sins of their fathers. Am I the only one? It was just 9 chapters ago. You're going to murder babies and then 9 chapters later say you're not going to have children pay for the sins of their fathers? What? Do you know how many babies just starved to death in this story? Come on. This Bible. Let's do chapter 20:25. Moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good, and rules by which they could not have life, and I defiled them through their very gifts and their offering up all their firstborn, that I might devastate them. I did that they might know that I am Lord. I'm just going to let it sit with you. I think to do this verse, the negative justice it deserves is just to let it be. Just hear those words. I'm not going to go on and explain how horrific it is. This is your God. He did things on purpose for them that were bad, that set them up for failure because he was pissed. Read the context before. Oh, I did this for them, but then I gave them a second chance in the desert. Oh, I did this for them, but I didn't want my name spoiled amongst the nations, so I pulled back for my own namesake. But now, time to know that I am Lord, and I will devastate them. To lighten things up, so to speak, remember when I told you that Israel gets compared to all of these horrific things, and one of them is these 2 promiscuous sisters? This leads to one of the most insane verses in the Bible, and I understand putting it within its context. This is a story that is being told to show the sinful nature of these promiscuous sisters and thus just how bad Israel is. But does this really need to be in the Bible? And I'd love for Christians to take note of this verse when they're trying to ban books that want to leave the Bibles in the library. So this comes to us from 23. We have these 2 sisters we're hearing all about what whores they are. The Bible's words, not mine. Let me start around 17. And the Babylonians came to her in the bed of love, and they defiled her with their whoring lust. And after she was defiled by them, she turned from them in disgust. When she carried on her whoring so openly and flaunted her nakedness, I turned in disgust from her, as I turned in disgust from her sister. Yet she increased her whoring, remembering the days of her youth, when she played the whore in the land of Egypt, and lusted after her lovers, whose members were like those of donkeys, and whose issue, see if you can figure out what they're describing here, was that of horses. Thus you longed for the lewdness of your youth, when the Egyptians handled your bosom and pressed your young breasts. So, once again, we have Israel depicted as a whore. Why? Well, it's a fine comparison coming from God because they are worshiping gods of other lands. So they're not staying true to their beloved. They are committing infidelity in the form of worship. Okay, God wants to make a comparison with that. Fine, problematic, but all right. You want to use some really descriptive language like her open nakedness, her lewdness, her whoring. Okay, but pray tell, what could be the reasoning for describing in such vivid detail the size of the penises or the amount of the load? I'll wait. This God who ordains this book, who cannot bring himself to cover things like don't enslave people, don't hurt children. Sorry if you're sick of hearing those examples. You're going to keep hearing them from me. 2 of the things that could have saved a world, literally billions of people from unnecessary suffering because it wasn't written here. But we can talk about how much semen was coming out of the symbolic lovers of Israel's whoredom. Got it. This is in 39:17. As for you, son of man, thus says the Lord God, speak to the birds of every sort and to all beasts of the field. Assemble and come, gather from all around to the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast on the mountains of Israel. And you shall eat flesh and drink blood. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams and lambs and he-goats and bulls, and of the fat beast of Bashan. And you shall eat fat till you are filled, and drink blood till you are drunk, in the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you. And you shall be filled with the table of my horses and charioteers, with mighty men and all kinds of warriors, declares the Lord God. And I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid on them. The house of Israel shall now know that I am the Lord their God from that day forward. And the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they dealt so treacherously with me, and I hid my face from them, and gave them into the hand of their adversaries, and they all fell by the sword. I dealt with them according to their uncleanness and their transgressions, and I hid my face from them. There's a lot there. There's a whole bunch there, from the animal sacrifice to the imagery of drunk on blood, which is something that would be so common for this warlord God, to using his people as an example to show the nations and his destruction, his hiding his face, his closing his ears, all of the things that this God does and says in this book. It's horrendous. Again, there's so many other things. We get all the destruction of the other nations and God killing women and children. We get the issues like in chapter 14, where God is talking about how he will not listen, how even the most just people, Noah, Daniel, Job, etc., could not convince God. We've talked so much about this God not listening to prayers that I don't need to rehash it. And again, we did mention earlier, and this will be the last thing I say, the verses that talk about God softening their hearts so as to create the people that will love him, which the whole thing, right, is that we're not supposed to be robots, that God didn't just make us in a way where we would choose him. So he gave us free will. And what did everyone do with that free will according to the Bible? They rejected God. They worshipped other idols. They disobeyed. They didn't follow his law or his commands. He punished. They repented. The cycle continued. And God got so fed up that he stopped listening. He does his final huge judgment. He finally lets the temple be destroyed. He takes these people into captivity. And now what? Did they actually repent? Did they change their ways? How do we get them being released from captivity, going back, making a new temple, starting over again with God? How? The answer is clear. God changed their hearts. Not symbolically, God interfered with their will so that they would be of the kind that would seek him best. And that, my friends, is Ezekiel. I hope that you enjoyed this one. Let me know your thoughts. There are so many more problematic passages. If you want to share your favorites of those, so to speak, in the comments, feel free. Anything I missed, anything that you think is interesting about this book, please let me know. If I got anything wrong, let me know. This is a lot of material to cover, and I have essentially 1 week to prepare for each because I really do want to be timely with these. Not complaining. I absolutely love covering this stuff with you guys, but I do always worry about missing something or getting something incorrect. So this is for all of us. And the comment section is hopefully an addition to my presentation here, where we can continue to learn about each of these books in the proper, objective, and secular way. So thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day. I'm not sure yet if we'll be able to get episode 5 of Dissecting the Divine out this Saturday, but for sure, Sunday at 9 a.m., we will have our second part of the God's Therapy videos that I'm doing. And this one is 20 examples of God being a bad therapist. Until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, Karolina, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Rokkit, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine patrons. Thanks, and have a great day.